What started as a routine night for Thalia Vance, a tech billionaire worth over $400 million, turned into a nightmare when 5 armed men cornered her in a deserted parking garage. With no security, no witnesses, and nowhere to run, she was completely helpless. But what happened next shocked everyone involved. Silas Korath, a struggling single father who worked 3 jobs just to make ends meet, appeared out of nowhere and single-handedly fought off all 5 attackers with his bare hands. He saved a complete stranger's life without asking for anything in return. But here's the twist that will blow your mind. Thalia had no idea that this hero, this man who risked everything to protect her, was the same person she was about to evict from his apartment the very next morning. Because unknown to both of them, she owned his entire building. What happened when she discovered this truth changed both their lives forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The underground parking garage of Meridian Tower stretched endlessly beneath the gleaming downtown district of Ashford Heights, its fluorescent lights flickering intermittently, casting eerie shadows between concrete pillars. At 11:30 on a Tuesday night, the vast space lay nearly deserted, save for a handful of luxury vehicles scattered across the premium parking levels. Thalia Vance stepped out of her silver Bentley Continental, her Louboutin heels clicking against the cold concrete as she gathered her belongings from the passenger seat. The tech billionaire had just finished a grueling board meeting that had stretched well past its scheduled time, discussing the quarterly projections for her artificial intelligence company, NeuralSync Technologies. At 34, she had built an empire worth over $400 million, revolutionizing how businesses integrated AI into their daily operations. Tonight, however, she felt the weight of her success pressing down on her shoulders. The meeting had revealed concerning trends in their latest product rollout, and 3 major investors were threatening to pull their funding if the issues weren't resolved within the next quarter. Thalia clutched her Hermes briefcase tighter, knowing it contained the preliminary research data that could either save her company or signal the beginning of its downfall. She had parked on level B3, the most exclusive section reserved for penthouse residents and premium office tenants. The space was supposed to be monitored by state-of-the-art security cameras and patrolled regularly by building security, but tonight felt different. The usual hum of ventilation systems seemed muted, and several of the overhead lights had burned out, creating pockets of darkness between the parked cars. Thalia's phone buzzed with another urgent email from her head of development, but she ignored it, too exhausted to process any more crisis management tonight. She had moved to Ashford Heights specifically because of its reputation as the safest upscale district in the city, where crime rates were virtually non-existent and security was supposed to be paramount. As she walked toward the elevator bank, her footsteps echoed through the cavernous space, each click amplified by the concrete walls and low ceiling. The elevator seemed impossibly far away, and she began to regret parking so deep underground. Her usual spot on level B1 had been occupied, forcing her to venture down to the lower levels where the lighting was sparse and the security presence minimal. That's when she heard them. The sound of multiple footsteps, deliberately muffled but unmistakably coordinated, began to match her pace from somewhere behind her. Thalia's pulse quickened as she risked a glance over her shoulder, spotting 5 shadowy figures emerging from between the parked vehicles. They moved with purpose, their faces obscured by dark hoodies and baseball caps, but their intent was unmistakable. Fear shot through her body like electricity as she realized her situation. The elevator was still 50 yards away, her phone had no signal in the underground garage, and the security cameras that should have been recording everything appeared to have been disabled. Red lights blinked ominously where green ones should have indicated active monitoring. Thalia quickened her pace, her heels now working against her as they clicked louder against the concrete, practically announcing her location to her pursuers. Her heart hammered in her chest as she calculated her options, all of which seemed hopeless. She was alone, unarmed, and facing 5 men who had clearly planned this encounter carefully. "Hey lady," called out a gravelly voice from behind her, "we just want to talk." The casual tone did nothing to mask the menace underneath, and Thalia broke into a run, abandoning any pretense of calm. Her briefcase bounced against her leg as she sprinted toward the elevator, her expensive heels making each step precarious on the smooth concrete floor. But they were faster. The men closed the distance quickly, their athletic builds and practical footwear giving them every advantage. Within seconds, they had surrounded her, cutting off any escape route to the elevator, the stairwell, or even back to her car. The fluorescent light above flickered erratically, casting their faces in alternating shadows and harsh illumination. "Easy now," said the apparent leader, a tall man with scarred hands and cold eyes. "This doesn't have to get complicated. Just hand over the briefcase, your jewelry, and whatever cash you're carrying, and nobody gets hurt." Thalia clutched her briefcase protectively, knowing it contained more than just research data. Her laptop held access codes to NeuralSync's most sensitive projects, financial records worth millions, and personal information that could destroy not just her company, but several of her business partners. Beyond its monetary value, the briefcase represented years of work, countless late nights, and the dreams of hundreds of employees who depended on NeuralSync for their livelihoods. "I can give you money," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I can transfer whatever you want, but I need that briefcase. It contains nothing valuable to you but everything valuable to me." The leader laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "Lady, you're not in a position to negotiate. You're gonna give us everything, or we're gonna take everything. Your choice how easy you want to make this." The other 4 men stepped closer, forming in tighter circle around her. Thalia could smell stale cigarettes and cheap cologne, could see the hungry expressions on their faces as they assessed her diamond earrings, her Cartier watch, and the designer purse slung over her shoulder. These weren't desperate addicts looking for a quick score. They were professional criminals who had studied their target and chosen their moment carefully. "Please," Thalia tried once more, her voice now betraying her terror. "I'll give you whatever money you want. I can access my accounts right now, transfer hundreds of thousands if you just let me keep my work files." "See, that's where you're wrong," the leader said, pulling a knife from his jacket and letting the blade catch the fluorescent light. "We already know exactly what you're worth, Miss Vance. We know about your penthouse, your company, your bank accounts. We're not here for whatever cash you're carrying. We're here for everything." The use of her name sent ice through her veins. This wasn't a random mugging, it was a targeted attack. They had researched her, studied her routines, and planned this encounter down to the smallest detail. They knew she often worked late, knew she parked in this section, knew she would be alone and vulnerable. As the reality of her situation sank in, Thalia realized that her money, her success, and her carefully constructed life of privilege had made her a target rather than providing her with protection. All the security measures she paid for, all the exclusive locations she frequented, all the barriers she had built between herself and the dangers of the world had failed her when she needed them most. The men began to close in, their confidence growing as they sensed her helplessness. Thalia backed against a concrete pillar, the cold surface pressing through her silk blouse as she clutched her briefcase to her chest. In that moment, surrounded by predators in the depths of a parking garage where no one could hear her scream, the tech billionaire, who commanded boardrooms and influenced global markets, felt more powerless than she ever had in her life. The fluorescent light above finally gave up its fight, plunging their corner of the garage into near total darkness, broken only by the distant glow of emergency exit signs and the occasional flicker of the dying bulbs. In the shadows, 5 pairs of eyes gleamed with anticipation as they prepared to take everything from a woman who had worked her entire life to build something meaningful, only to see it threatened by those who preferred to take rather than create. The sound of a heavy door slamming shut echoed through the parking garage, followed by the distinctive rumble of an aging pickup truck engine that had seen better days. Silas Korath pulled his battered Ford F-150 into one of the few remaining spots on level B3, the truck's engine coughing and sputtering before finally falling silent. He sat for a moment in the driver's seat, rubbing his tired eyes and checking his phone for the time. Midnight. Another 16-hour day was finally over. At 28, Silas had the weathered hands and tired eyes of someone who had been working manual labor jobs since he was barely old enough to hold a hammer. His current position as head maintenance supervisor for Meridian Tower was actually a step up from his previous employment history, which included everything from construction work to restaurant dishwashing to overnight security guard duties. The building management company had hired him 6 months ago, impressed by his work ethic and his ability to fix virtually anything that broke. What they didn't know was that Silas had been sleeping in his truck more nights than not, unable to afford both rent and the basic necessities for daily survival. His apartment in the Greystone district was 3 months behind on rent, and his landlord had started leaving increasingly threatening notices on his door. The irony wasn't lost on him that he spent his days maintaining a building where a single month's rent for one of the premium units would solve all his financial problems. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Tonight he had stayed late to repair a malfunctioning HVAC unit on the 15th floor, a job that should have been handled by the day shift but had been passed down to him because nobody else wanted to work past their scheduled hours. The repair had taken longer than expected, requiring him to disassemble half the system to reach a corroded component that had probably been failing for months. As he gathered his tools from the truck bed, Silas heard something that made him freeze. Voices, multiple voices, coming from the direction of the elevator bank. But it wasn't the casual conversation of residents heading home late. There was an edge to the voices, a predatory quality that triggered every survival instinct he had developed growing up in the rougher neighborhoods of the city. He moved quietly between the parked cars, his work boots silent against the concrete floor. Years of living paycheck to paycheck in dangerous areas had taught him to assess threats quickly and move without being detected. As he got closer to the source of the voices, he could make out individual words. Just hand it over, and nobody gets hurt. We know exactly what you're worth, Miss Vance. Silas crept closer, using the concrete pillars and parked vehicles for cover, until he had a clear view of the situation. 5 men had surrounded a woman in expensive business attire, and even in the dim lighting, he could see the knife blade gleaming in one of their hands. The woman was pressed against a pillar, clutching a briefcase to her chest, her face pale with terror. Every rational part of his mind told him to walk away. These weren't his problems, and he had enough troubles of his own without getting involved in whatever was happening here. He was one person against 5. He had no weapons beyond the basic tools in his belt, and he had no legal authority to intervene in what was clearly a serious crime in progress. But Silas had grown up watching his mother work 3 jobs to keep food on their table, had seen her struggle against people who thought they could take advantage of someone they perceived as powerless. He had sworn to himself long ago that he would never walk away when someone needed help, regardless of the personal cost. More importantly, something about this situation struck him as fundamentally wrong beyond the obvious criminality. This wasn't a random mugging. The attackers were too organized, too confident, too familiar with their victim. They had planned this, which meant they would likely escalate the violence regardless of whether the woman cooperated. Silas quietly set down his tool bag and pulled out the largest wrench he had, a heavy steel implement that could serve as an improvised weapon if necessary. He took a deep breath, calculating angles and distances, identifying which attacker posed the greatest immediate threat and which ones might flee if the situation turned against them. Then he stepped out from behind the parked BMW, where he had been concealed. "Evening, gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the garage. "Seems like you're having some kind of misunderstanding here." The 5 men spun around, clearly startled by his sudden appearance. Their leader, still holding the knife, quickly assessed this new threat. Silas was tall and lean, with the kind of practical strength that came from years of physical labor, but he was still just one man facing 5 attackers. "Walk away, buddy," the leader called out, trying to maintain his confidence. "This isn't your business, and you don't want to make it your business." Silas continued walking toward them, the wrench hanging casually at his side. His work clothes were stained with oil and dust, his hands were rough and scarred from countless repair jobs, and his pickup truck behind him looked like it might not start again in the morning. To these predators, he probably looked like just another working-class guy who would back down when faced with superior numbers. They had no way of knowing that Silas had been in more fights than he cared to remember, that his childhood had been spent dodging bullies and protecting younger kids from the same kind of predatory behavior they were displaying now. They couldn't see the coiled tension in his movements, the way his eyes tracked each of their positions, or the calculating intelligence behind his seemingly casual approach. "See, here's the thing," Silas said, stopping about 10 feet away from the group. "I work maintenance for this building, which means I'm responsible for keeping everything in working order. That includes making sure residents and visitors don't get hassled in the parking garage." The woman behind the attackers looked at him with a mixture of hope and terror, clearly unsure whether his intervention would help or simply make her situation worse. Silas caught her eye for just a moment and gave her an almost imperceptible nod, a signal that she should be ready to move when the opportunity presented itself. "You're making a mistake," the leader said, raising his knife slightly. "There's 5 of us and 1 of you. Do the math and walk away while you still can." Silas shifted his weight slightly, the movement so subtle that none of the attackers recognized it as a fighting stance. He had learned long ago that the key to surviving outnumbered fights was to move fast, hit hard, and never let your opponents coordinate their attacks. "You know what I think," Silas said, his voice remaining conversational despite the tension. "I think you boys picked the wrong parking garage and the wrong target. This lady looks like she's had a long day, and she probably just wants to go home. Why don't you make everyone's life easier and head out the way you came in?" The attackers exchanged glances, clearly uncertain how to handle this unexpected complication. They had planned for security guards, building staff, or even police intervention, but they hadn't expected a lone maintenance worker to voluntarily insert himself into their operation. "Last chance, hero," the leader snarled, taking a step forward. "Walk away, or we'll put you down right next to her." Silas smiled, an expression that somehow managed to be both friendly and utterly cold. "Well," he said, adjusting his grip on the wrench, "I guess we'll see about that." The fluorescent lights continued their erratic flickering, casting the confrontation in alternating light and shadow. The woman pressed against the pillar held her breath, clutching her briefcase, and trying to make herself as small as possible. The 5 attackers tightened their formation, preparing to deal with this unexpected obstacle to their carefully planned crime. And in the center of it all, Silas Korath stood calmly, a working-class hero who had no idea that the woman he was about to risk everything to protect was the same person who owned his apartment building, the same person whose property management company had been sending him eviction notices, the same person who could solve all his financial problems with a single signature on a check. All he knew was that someone needed help, and he had never been the kind of person to walk away from that. What happened next unfolded with a violence so swift and precise that Thalia could barely process the sequence of events. One moment, 5 predators were closing in on her with confident malice, and the next, the parking garage had become a battlefield where the maintenance worker moved like controlled lightning. The leader lunged first, his knife arcing toward Silas in a vicious overhand strike that should have ended the fight before it truly began. But Silas wasn't where the blade expected to find him. He had already stepped inside the attack, his heavy wrench connecting with the man's wrist with a sickening crack that sent the knife spinning across the concrete floor. Before the leader could even scream, Silas spun and drove his elbow into the second attacker's solar plexus, doubling him over and leaving him gasping for air on his knees. The third man tried to circle behind him, but Silas had anticipated the movement, pivoting and catching him across the temple with the flat side of the wrench. The attacker crumpled instantly, unconscious before he hit the ground. The 4th and 5th men hesitated for just a moment, suddenly realizing that their numerical advantage meant nothing against someone who moved with such devastating efficiency. That hesitation cost them everything. Silas grabbed the 4th man by his hoodie and used his momentum to slam him face first into the concrete pillar where Thalia was still pressed. The impact left a smear of blood on the pillar, and another attacker motionless on the floor. The last man standing finally found his nerve and charged,
but he was too slow and too predictable. Silas sidestepped the clumsy rush and brought the wrench down across the man's shoulder blade, sending him sprawling across the hood of a nearby Mercedes. The attacker slid off the car and lay groaning on the concrete, clearly finished. The entire confrontation had lasted less than 30 seconds. Silas stood in the aftermath, breathing slightly harder than normal, but otherwise showing no signs of the brutal efficiency he had just displayed. He surveyed the 5 incapacitated men scattered around the parking space, ensuring that none of them posed any further threat. The leader was cradling his shattered wrist, the knife now safely out of reach. The others were either unconscious or too injured to continue fighting. "Are you hurt?" Silas asked, turning to Thalia with the same calm tone he had used throughout the confrontation. His work clothes were barely disheveled, and the wrench hung casually at his side, as if he had just finished tightening the bolt, rather than neutralizing 5 dangerous criminals. Thalia stared at him in shock, her mind struggling to process what she had just witnessed. This maintenance worker, this ordinary-looking man in stained coveralls and work boots, had just single-handedly defeated 5 attackers, with a level of skill that seemed almost supernatural. Her hands were shaking so badly that she could barely maintain her grip on her briefcase. "I'm okay," she managed to whisper, though her voice betrayed the lie. She was physically unharmed, but emotionally she was reeling from how close she had come to disaster, and how completely this stranger had turned the tide of her situation. "Good," Silas said, pulling his cell phone from his pocket. "I'm calling the police. These guys aren't going anywhere, but we should get some official help down here to clean this up." As he dialed 911, Thalia found herself studying her unexpected savior more carefully. He was probably in his late 20s, with a kind of lean functional build that came from physical labor rather than gym workouts. His hands were scarred and calloused. His work clothes were clean but well worn, and there was an alertness in his eyes that suggested this kind of violence wasn't entirely foreign to him. "Police? Yeah, I need units at Meridian Tower, level B3 parking garage. 5 suspects attempted armed robbery, all suspects subdued and requiring medical attention. 1 victim, unharmed. I'll be here waiting." He ended the call and slipped the phone back into his pocket, then turned his attention back to Thalia. For the first time since the attack had begun, she felt safe enough to step away from the concrete pillar, though her legs were still unsteady from the adrenaline and shock. "How did you do that?" she asked, genuinely amazed. 5 men with weapons, and you made it look easy." Silas shrugged, seemingly uncomfortable with the attention. "Grew up in some rough neighborhoods. Had to learn to take care of myself early. Plus they weren't as tough as they wanted to appear. Bullies usually aren't." He moved around the scene, checking on the condition of each attacker, and ensuring that any weapons were secured. The leader was conscious, but clearly in significant pain from his broken wrist. 2 others were starting to stir from their unconscious states, groaning and trying to orient themselves. "Stay down," Silas advised them firmly. "Police are on their way, and I'd prefer not to have to put you down again." The authority in his voice was unmistakable, and the injured men made no attempt to get up or continue their attack. They seemed to understand that they had encountered someone far more dangerous than his maintenance worker appearance had suggested. "I don't know how to thank you," Thalia said, her voice stronger now but still shaky. "If you hadn't been here, if you hadn't intervened." "Don't think about it," Silas interrupted gently. "You're safe now, that's what matters. Though I have to ask, what are you doing down here alone at this time of night? This isn't exactly the safest place for someone carrying expensive jewelry in a briefcase." Thalia looked down at herself, suddenly aware of how her appearance had made her a target. Her Cartier watch, her diamond earrings, her designer clothes and accessories, all screamed wealth and vulnerability. She had been so focused on her business problems that she had ignored basic personal security considerations. "I work late a lot," she admitted. "I had a board meeting that ran long, and I didn't think about the risks of walking to my car alone. I guess I've been living in a bubble." The sound of sirens echoed through the parking garage as the first police units arrived. Within minutes, the scene was swarming with officers, paramedics, and detectives. The 5 attackers were arrested and loaded into ambulances for treatment of their injuries, before being transported to jail. Silas and Thalia spent the next 2 hours, giving detailed statements, with multiple officers expressing amazement at how one man had subdued 5 armed attackers, without sustaining any injuries himself. "You're lucky, mister. Korath was here tonight," Detective Martinez told Thalia, as they concluded the paperwork. "These guys had been planning this for weeks. We found surveillance equipment in their vehicle, photos of your routine, floor plans of the building. This wasn't a random mugging. It was a targeted kidnapping attempt." The revelation sent fresh chills through Thalia. She had assumed it was a simple robbery, but the reality was far more sinister. They had been studying her, learning her patterns, preparing to take her somewhere private, where they could extract everything of value before disposing of her. "The good news is that they're all talking now," the detective continued, "trying to cut deals by giving up information about who hired them. This kind of operation doesn't happen without serious financial backing." As the crime scene finally cleared, and the last police vehicle departed, Thalia found herself alone with Silas in the parking garage. The fluorescent lights had been repaired by building maintenance, casting everything in harsh, bright illumination that made the bloodstains on the concrete look stark and real. "Can I at least buy you dinner?" Thalia asked, realizing how inadequate the gesture seemed given what he had done for her. "Or coffee. Something to show my appreciation."
Silas glanced at his watch and smiled slightly. "It's past 2 in the morning. I don't think many places are open for dinner at this hour. There's a 24-hour diner about 6 blocks from here," Thalia said, surprising herself with her knowledge of late-night establishments. She had never eaten at such places, but her security team had briefed her on various locations for emergency situations. "I don't want to keep you up," Silas said, though there was something in his expression that suggested he wouldn't mind the company. "You've had a traumatic night. You should probably go home and get some rest." "I don't think I could sleep right now even if I tried," Thalia admitted. "The adrenaline is still pumping, and I keep thinking about what could have happened if you hadn't been here." They stood there for a moment, 2 people from completely different worlds who had been brought together by violence and were now connected by something neither of them fully understood. Thalia looked at this man, who had risked his life for a complete stranger, who had asked for nothing in return, who seemed genuinely more concerned about her well-being than his own recognition or reward. "All right," Silas said finally. "Coffee sounds good, but I'm driving separately. My truck might not look like much, but it runs." As they walked toward their respective vehicles, Thalia realized that she didn't even know basic information about the man who had saved her life. She knew his name from the police report, knew he worked maintenance for her building, but beyond that he was a mystery. A mystery who had just demonstrated skills and courage that most people only possessed in fiction. What she didn't know, as she climbed into her Bentley and followed his battered pickup truck toward the diner, was that Silas Korath lived in an apartment building that she owned through a shell corporation, that he was 3 months behind on rent, and that her property management company had scheduled his eviction for the following morning. The irony of the situation would become apparent soon enough, but for now, all that mattered was that 2 people who had shared an extraordinary experience were about to sit down together and try to make sense of a night that had changed both their lives in ways they couldn't yet imagine. The Golden Griddle Diner sat on the corner of 5th and Madison like a time capsule from the 1950s, its neon sign flickering intermittently in the pre-dawn darkness. Chrome stools lined a counter that had seen thousands of late-night conversations, while red vinyl booths offered privacy for those seeking refuge from the outside world. At 2:30 a.m. on a Wednesday morning, the establishment hosted an eclectic mix of night shift workers, insomniacs, and people whose lives had been disrupted by circumstances beyond their control. Thalia had never set foot in such a place. Her usual dining experiences involved reservations at establishments with Michelin stars, private dining rooms, and wine lists that cost more than most people earned in a month. But as she slid into the cracked vinyl booth across from Silas, she found something oddly comforting about the unpretentious atmosphere and the aroma of coffee that had been brewing since the Carter administration. 2 coffees, black, Silas told the waitress, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes and comfortable shoes who looked like she had been working night shifts for decades. Make mine with cream and sugar, please, Thalia added, earning a slight smile from Silas. Not a black coffee kind of person, he asked as the waitress moved away. I usually drink espresso, Thalia admitted, from a machine that costs more than most people's cars, but tonight feels like a good time to try something different. They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, both processing the events that had brought them together. The diner's other patrons paid them no attention. A woman in expensive business attire sitting across from a maintenance worker was apparently not unusual enough to merit interest in this particular establishment. So Thalia said finally, "What made you decide to work maintenance at Meridian Tower? You clearly have skills that could open other doors." Silas stirred his coffee thoughtfully before answering. "Steady work, decent pay for what it is, and they don't ask too many questions about your background. Plus I like fixing things. There's something satisfying about taking something broken and making it work again." "What did you do before?" Thalia pressed gently. "Various things," Silas replied, his tone suggesting that he preferred not to elaborate. "Construction, security work, whatever paid the bills. I've never been the type to plan too far ahead. Just focus on getting through each day and hope tomorrow brings something better." The waitress returned with their coffee and a plate of pie that nobody had ordered but that she apparently felt was necessary for the situation. "On the house," she said with a wink. "You both look like you've had the kind of night that requires pie." After she left, Thalia took a sip of her coffee and was surprised to find it better than she had expected. Not the artisanal quality she was accustomed to, but honest and strong, and exactly what the moment required. "What about you?" Silas asked. "What kind of work keeps you in the office until midnight on a Tuesday?" "I run a technology company," Thalia said, unconsciously downplaying her role. "We develop artificial intelligence solutions for businesses. It's complicated and often stressful, but I love the challenge of building something that didn't exist before." "Must be successful," Silas observed, gesturing toward her jewelry and designer clothing. "Successful enough," Thalia agreed. "But success comes with its own problems, like making yourself a target for people who think taking is easier than earning." They talked for another hour, their conversation ranging from work to philosophy to the strange circumstances that had brought them together. Thalia found herself genuinely enjoying the discussion, appreciating Silas's straightforward perspective and his lack of agenda. He wasn't trying to impress her, wasn't angling for business connections or investment opportunities, wasn't performing the careful social dance that characterized most of her interactions. For his part, Silas was intrigued by this successful businesswoman who seemed genuinely interested in his thoughts and experiences. Despite her obvious wealth and privilege, she listened more than she talked and asked thoughtful questions rather than making assumptions about his life or circumstances. It wasn't until they were preparing to leave that fate decided to reveal its twisted sense of humor. Thalia was searching through her purse for her car keys, when an envelope fell out and landed on the table between them. The envelope was white with a logo that Silas recognized immediately. Pinnacle Property Management, the company that handled his apartment building. "Sorry," Thalia said, reaching for the envelope. "Work papers. They follow me everywhere." But Silas was staring at the logo with a mixture of confusion and growing concern. "Pinnacle Property Management," he said slowly. "You work with them." "Work with them?" Thalia laughed. "I own them. It's one of my smaller companies, handles residential properties throughout the city. Not very glamorous compared to the tech work, but it provides steady revenue stream." The color drained from Silas's face as the implications hit him like a physical blow. "You own Pinnacle, among other things," Thalia confirmed, not yet understanding why he seemed so upset. "Real estate has been good to me over the years." "Why do you ask?" Silas reached into his wallet and pulled out a crumpled notice that had been folded and refolded multiple times. He smoothed it out on the table between them, the Pinnacle Property Management letterhead clearly visible at the top. Final notice of eviction. The document read, Tenant, Silas Koreth, Unit 4B, Riverside Heights Apartments. Thalia stared at the paper, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. Her eyes moved from the notice to Silas's face, then back to the notice as the cruel irony of the situation became clear. "This is your eviction notice?" she asked quietly. "Scheduled for this morning," Silas confirmed, his voice tight with emotion. "I'm 3 months behind on rent. Lost my previous job when the construction company went under, and it took me 2 months to find the position at Meridian Tower. I've been trying to catch up, but the late fees and penalties keep piling up faster than I can pay them down." Thalia picked up the notice and read it more carefully, noting the amount owed and the threatening language about legal action and property seizure. It was signed by James Morrison, the property manager she paid to handle such matters so she didn't have to deal with them personally. "I had no idea," she said, which was true but sounded pathetic even to her own ears. "I don't handle the day-to-day operations of the property management side. I have people who throw people out on the street when they can't make rent," Silas finished bitterly. "I get it. It's business, not personal. Just numbers on a spreadsheet." The coffee suddenly tasted like ash in Thalia's mouth. Here was a man who had risked his life to save her from 5 armed attackers, who had asked for nothing in return, who had treated her with kindness and respect despite their obvious differences in circumstances, and in a few hours, her company was going to put him and his possessions out on the sidewalk. "How much do you owe?" she asked. "Does it matter?" Silas replied, sliding the notice back into his wallet. "The decision's been made. Your property manager was very clear that there would be no more extensions, no payment plans, no exceptions. I've got until 9 a.m. to be out, or the sheriff will remove me." Thalia felt sick. She had built her wealth partially on the backs of people like Silas, people who struggled to make rent while she collected checks and complained about profit margins. She had insulated herself from the human cost of her business decisions, letting other people handle the unpleasant necessity of evictions and collections. "I can fix this," she said urgently. "I can call Morrison right now, cancel the eviction, work out a payment plan." "Can you?" Silas asked, his tone skeptical. "Or will you call your property manager tomorrow and tell him to give the troublesome tenant another month because you're feeling guilty? What happens when that guilt fades? What happens the next time I'm short on rent?" The question hung between them like a barrier, highlighting the fundamental inequality of their positions. Thalia could fix his immediate problem with a phone call, but that very ability emphasized how precarious his situation was and how little control he had over his own life. "I saved your life tonight," Silas continued, his voice quiet but intense. "I didn't know who you were, didn't expect anything in return. I did it because it was the right thing to do. But now I find out that the person I risked everything to protect is the same person who's about to make me homeless." Thalia wanted to argue, wanted to explain that she wasn't personally responsible for every business decision made by her various companies, but she knew that such explanations were just elaborate ways of avoiding responsibility for the consequences of her choices. "You're right," she said finally. "This is wrong, all of it. The way my companies operate, the way I've insulated myself from the human impact of business decisions. You shouldn't have to worry about losing your home because you hit a rough patch." Silas studied her face, looking for signs of manipulation or calculation, but all he saw was genuine distress and what appeared to be sincere regret. "What are you saying?" he asked. "I'm saying that meeting you tonight has opened my eyes to some things I've been willfully blind to," Thalia replied, "and I want to find a way to make this right, not just for you, but for everyone who's been caught in this kind of situation." The diner had grown quieter as the night shift workers headed home and the early morning crowd had not yet arrived. The two of them sat in their booth, surrounded by the detritus of their late-night conversation, trying to figure out how to navigate the complex moral landscape that had opened up between them.
Neither of them knew that this moment would become the foundation for changes that would affect not just their own lives, but the lives of hundreds of families throughout the city. All they knew was that the universe had played a cruel joke by bringing them together under circumstances that revealed both the best and worst aspects of the society they lived in. The woman who had everything was learning that her wealth had come at a cost she had never bothered to calculate. And the man who had nothing was discovering that sometimes the most powerful people are also the most capable of change, if they can find the courage to confront the consequences of their choices.
The first hints of dawn were beginning to creep over the Ashford Heights skyline when Thalia and Silas finally left the Golden Griddle Diner. The parking lot was nearly empty, except for their two vehicles, the stark contrast between her gleaming Bentley and his weathered pickup truck serving as a physical reminder of the economic gulf between them. But as they stood beside their cars in the cool morning air, something had fundamentally shifted in the dynamic between them. The revelation about the eviction notice had stripped away the polite social distance that wealth and circumstance typically maintained, leaving them to confront the raw reality of their interconnected lives. "I want you to know," Thalia said, breaking the silence that had stretched between them during the last few minutes in the diner, "that I meant what I said in there. This situation, what my company is doing to you, it's not acceptable." Silas leaned against his truck, his expression guarded but not hostile. "And what exactly are you proposing to do about it? Cancel my eviction out of guilt, maybe knock a few hundred off my rent for a couple months until your conscience feels better?" The bitterness in his voice was understandable, but it stung nonetheless. Thalia recognized that anything she offered now would seem like charity or manipulation, a powerful person buying their way out of moral complexity rather than addressing the fundamental issues at play. "No," she said firmly. "That would just be a band-aid on a much larger problem. What I'm proposing is more comprehensive than that." She pulled out her phone and began scrolling through her contacts, looking for the number she needed. "First, I'm calling James Morrison right now to cancel your eviction and any others scheduled for this week. Then I'm scheduling an emergency meeting with my property management team to review our entire approach to tenant relations. It's 4:30 in the morning," Silas pointed out. "Morrison is paid very well to be available when I need him," Thalia replied, pressing the call button. The phone rang only twice before a groggy voice answered. "James, it's Thalia Vance. I need you to immediately cancel any evictions scheduled for today and send me a complete list of all tenants currently facing eviction proceedings." She listened for a moment to Morrison's confused protests, then cut him off with an authority that brooked no argument. "I don't care what the policies are. I'm changing the policies. Have the list to me by 9 a.m. and clear your schedule for this afternoon. We're having a comprehensive review of how Pinnacle handles tenant issues." After ending the call, she turned back to Silas. "Your eviction is canceled, but that's just the beginning." "And what comes after the beginning?" Silas asked, clearly skeptical about where this was heading. Thalia took a deep breath, recognizing that what she was about to propose would sound either incredibly naive or genuinely revolutionary, depending on one's perspective. "I want you to come work for me," she said, "not in maintenance, and not as some token gesture of goodwill. I want you to help me completely restructure how my property management company operates." Silas raised an eyebrow. "I don't know anything about running a business, but you know everything about being on the receiving end of bad business practices," Thalia countered. "You understand what it's like to struggle with rent, to deal with unresponsive property managers, to face eviction despite your best efforts to make things work. That perspective is exactly what I need." She began pacing between their cars, her mind racing with possibilities she had never considered before. "I've been thinking about this wrong for years. I've been focused on maximizing profit margins and minimizing operational costs, treating housing as just another commodity to be optimized. But housing isn't just a commodity, it's where people build their lives." "That's a nice sentiment," Silas said, "but sentiment doesn't pay mortgages or keep the lights on. Your investors aren't going to appreciate you suddenly deciding to prioritize tenant welfare over returns." "Maybe it's time I stopped caring so much about what my investors appreciate," Thalia replied. Maybe it's time I started caring more about whether my business practices are actually making the world better or worse. The conversation was interrupted by Silas's phone buzzing with a text message. He glanced at it and winced. "What is it?" Thalia asked. "Sheriff's Department," Silas said, confirming the 9 a.m. eviction appointment. "I guess your property manager hasn't gotten the message to them yet." Thalia immediately dialed Morrison again, this time with considerably less patience. "James, the sheriff is still planning to execute the eviction of Silas Korath at 9 a.m. You need to contact them immediately and cancel that order. And while you're at it, I want you to halt all eviction proceedings company-wide until I've had a chance to review our policies." Another pause for Morrison's objections, then Thalia's voice turned cold. "James, you work for me. I'm not asking for your opinion. I'm giving you direct instructions. If you're not comfortable implementing them, I can find someone who is." She ended the call and looked at Silas. "The eviction is definitely canceled now, but I'm serious about the job offer. I want you to help me figure out how to run a property management company that actually serves its tenants, instead of just extracting maximum profit from them." "What makes you think I'm qualified for that kind of work?" Silas asked. "What made you qualified to take on 5 armed men in a parking garage?" Thalia countered. "Sometimes the right qualifications aren't the ones that show up on a resume. Sometimes they're about character, perspective, and the willingness to do what's right even when it's difficult." Silas was quiet for a long moment, considering the offer and its implications. "What exactly would this job involve?" "Honestly, I'm not entirely sure yet," Thalia admitted. "I'm making this up as I go along, but I'm thinking something like tenant advocacy coordinator, or director of community relations. Someone who interfaces between the company and the people living in our properties, who ensures that their voices are heard and their concerns are addressed." She pulled out her business card and wrote a number on the back. "This is my personal cell phone. I want you to think about it today. Maybe come by my office this afternoon, if you're interested. We can discuss salary, benefits, and exactly how this position would work." "What kind of salary are we talking about?" Silas asked, his practical nature asserting itself. "Whatever you're making now, plus enough to cover your back rent and get you caught up on your other bills," Thalia said. "And then we'll set a salary that reflects the importance of the work you'll be doing. Housing advocacy is specialized work. It should be compensated accordingly." The offer was almost too good to believe, which made Silas suspicious. "Why are you doing this? A few hours ago you didn't even know I existed. Now you want to restructure your business practices, and offer me a job that didn't exist yesterday." It was a fair question, and Thalia took a moment to formulate an honest answer. "Because tonight showed me something I've been avoiding for years," she said finally. "I've been so focused on building wealth and growing my companies, that I've lost sight of the impact my decisions have on real people. You risked your life to help a stranger, while my company was preparing to throw you out on the street. That's not just ironic, it's a fundamental indictment of how I've chosen to do business." She gestured toward the city skyline, where the morning sun was beginning to illuminate the glass towers that housed her various enterprises. "I have more money than I could spend in 10 lifetimes, but what's the point of that wealth if I'm using it in ways that make other people's lives harder? You showed me tonight that there are more important things than profit margins and quarterly growth targets." Silas studied her face, looking for signs of manipulation or insincerity. But what he saw was a woman who seemed genuinely shaken by their encounter, someone who was questioning fundamental assumptions about her life and work. "This isn't just charity?" he asked. "If it was charity, I'd write you a check and feel good about myself," Thalia replied. "What I'm proposing is much harder than charity. I'm asking you to help me figure out how to run a business that makes money while also making people's lives better. That's going to require real work, real commitment, and probably some real conflict with people who prefer the status quo." The morning traffic was beginning to pick up around them, early commuters, heading to jobs that would pay their bills and hopefully leave them enough to cover rent, groceries, and maybe a small emergency fund if they were lucky. Watching them pass, both Thalia and Silas were acutely aware of how precarious most people's financial situations really were. I'll think about it, Silas said finally. But I have one condition. What's that? If I take this job, I want to start by reviewing every single eviction case from the past year. I want to understand who's getting thrown out, why, and whether there were alternatives that could have kept families in their homes. Thalia nodded. Agreed. In fact, I want you to go further than that. I want you to review our entire tenant screening process, our rent increase policies, our maintenance response procedures, everything that affects how people experience living in our properties. They exchanged contact information and agreed to meet at NeuralSync Technologies headquarters later that afternoon. As they prepared to leave, Silas had one final question. What makes you think your board of directors and your investors are going to go along with this sudden change in business philosophy? Thalia smiled, an expression that held both determination and a hint of rebellious anticipation. I guess we're going to find out. But I've built these companies from nothing, and I still control the majority stake in most of them. If they don't like my new approach to business, they're welcome to find other investments. As she climbed into her Bentley and watched Silas drive away in his pickup truck, Thalia realized that she felt more energized and purposeful than she had in years. For the first time since building her business empire, she was excited about going to work for reasons that had nothing to do with profit margins or market domination. The woman who had started the night as a target for kidnappers was ending it as someone committed to using her wealth and influence to address the very inequalities that had made her a target in the first place. And the man who had started the night facing homelessness was ending it with an opportunity to help reshape how business could be done when human dignity was prioritized alongside financial success. Neither of them knew exactly how this experiment would turn out, but both were ready to find out. 3 months after that life-changing night in the parking garage, the 14th floor of the NeuralSync Technologies building had been transformed into something unprecedented in corporate America. What had once been a sterile conference room now served as the headquarters for Pinnacle Property Management's revolutionary tenant advocacy program, complete with a dedicated hotline, comfortable seating areas for private consultations, and walls covered with testimonials from families whose lives had been changed by the new approach to property management. Silas Korath sat behind a desk that still felt surreal, reviewing case files that represented real people facing housing crises throughout the city. His official title was Director of Community Relations, but in practice, he had become something much more significant: the bridge between corporate policy and human reality. The transformation in his circumstances was remarkable, but the changes he had implemented at Pinnacle were nothing short of revolutionary. Mrs. Patterson's rent assistance application has been approved, announced Jennifer Walsh, the social worker Silas had hired to help coordinate support services for struggling tenants. That's the third family this week we've been able to keep in their homes through the Emergency Assistance Fund. The Emergency Assistance Fund was one of Silas's most successful innovations, a pool of money that Thalia had established to help tenants facing temporary financial hardships. Rather than immediately starting eviction proceedings when rent was late, Pinnacle now offered interest-free loans, payment plans, and connections to social services that could address underlying problems. What's the total so far this quarter? Silas asked, though he already knew the numbers by heart. 47 families kept in stable housing, average cost per intervention $320, Jennifer replied. Compare that to the average cost of processing an eviction, which runs about $1,500 when you factor in legal fees, court costs, lost rent during vacancy, and rehabilitation expenses for new tenants. The financial argument was compelling, but for Silas, the real victory was measured in different terms. Children who didn't have to change schools, elderly residents who could age in familiar surroundings, working families who had time to address medical emergencies or job losses without losing their homes in the process. Thalia appeared in the doorway, having just finished a contentious board meeting that had focused heavily on the property management division's changing approach. Her expression was tense, a stark contrast to the enthusiasm she had shown during the early weeks of their collaboration. How did it go? Silas asked,
though her demeanor already provided most of the answer. Richard Hawthorne is organizing resistance, Thalia said, closing the door behind her and settling into one of the comfortable chairs that had replaced the intimidating conference table that once dominated the room. He's convinced 3 other board members that our social experiment is damaging shareholder value and setting dangerous precedents. Richard Hawthorne was Thalia's largest external investor, a man whose portfolio included everything from pharmaceutical companies to private prisons, all selected based on their ability to generate maximum returns regardless of their social impact. His opposition to the Pinnacle reforms had been growing steadily as the program gained public attention and media coverage. What kind of resistance? Silas asked, setting aside the case files to focus on what was clearly a serious threat to everything they had built. He's demanding detailed financial projections showing the long-term profitability of tenant advocacy programs, Thalia explained. He wants proof that treating tenants as human beings rather than revenue sources won't ultimately hurt our bottom line. And if you can't provide that proof, he's threatening to call for a vote of no confidence in my leadership, Thalia said quietly. He's arguing that I've lost sight of my fiduciary responsibility to investors, and that the company needs leadership that prioritizes profit over misguided social activism. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. The same business success that had made Thalia wealthy enough to implement these reforms was now being used as an argument against her right to continue them. Hawthorne and his allies were essentially claiming that making money gave them the authority to prevent others from using that money for social. Do they have the votes? Silas asked. Not yet, Thalia replied. But they're working on it. Hawthorne has been contacting other investors, sharing selective financial data that makes our tenant advocacy programs look like expensive charity rather than sound business practices. She stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the city where hundreds of families were living in Pinnacle properties under the new policies that prioritize stability and support over maximum profit extraction. The thing is, she continued, from a purely financial perspective, the programs are actually working. Tenant turnover is down 60%, maintenance costs are lower, because people take better care of homes they're not afraid of losing, and we're getting premium rental rates because word has spread about how we treat our tenants. Then why is Hawthorne pushing back so hard? Silas asked. Because it's not really about the money, Thalia said, turning away from the window. It's about control and precedent. If other companies see that treating people decently can be profitable, it threatens the entire model that people like Hawthorne use to justify their business practices. The conversation was interrupted by a knock on the door. Jennifer Walsh entered with an expression of excitement and concern. Sorry to interrupt, but I thought you should know that Channel 7 News is here, she announced. They want to do a feature story on the tenant advocacy program for their evening broadcast. Thalia and Silas exchanged glances. Media attention had been largely positive so far, with several newspapers and magazines featuring their story as an example of innovative corporate social responsibility. But television coverage would reach a much broader audience, and potentially attract more scrutiny from both supporters and critics. What's their angle? Thalia asked. They're calling it the unlikely partnership. How a parking garage hero transformed corporate housing, Jennifer replied. They want to interview both of you about how the program started, and what kind of results you're seeing. The media attention had been an unexpected consequence of their work together. The story of a wealthy CEO and a maintenance worker collaborating to reform predatory business practices had captured public imagination in ways that neither of them had anticipated. Silas in particular had been uncomfortable with the personal attention, preferring to focus on the work rather than his role in achieving. We should do it, Thalia said decisively. The more public support we can generate, the harder it will be for Hawthorne to argue that these programs are bad for business. Are you sure? Silas asked. More publicity means more scrutiny. If they dig into the details of how we met, of what was happening with my eviction notice, it could be embarrassing for both of us.
Let them dig, Thalia replied firmly. The truth is that this whole program started because I was forced to confront the human cost of my business practices. That's not embarrassing. It's the point. 2 hours later, they sat in the Tenant Advocacy Center while cameras captured them reviewing case files and discussing success stories. The reporter, Maria Santos from Channel 7, had clearly done her homework and asked pointed questions about both the financial and social implications of their approach. Critics argue that you're essentially subsidizing tenants who can't afford market-rate housing. Santos said to Thalia during one segment, "How do you respond to the charge that this creates unsustainable expectations and undermines the basic principles of free market economics?" I'd respond that those critics are defining market rate in terms that ignore the actual market conditions most people face. Thalia replied, "When someone loses their job due to a medical emergency, or when a single parent has to choose between paying rent and buying groceries, that's not a market failure on their part. That's a market that isn't accounting for the reality of human life." Santos turned to Silas. "You were facing eviction yourself when you first met Miss Vance. Some people might see your current position as a form of personal compensation rather than genuine policy reform. How do you address that concern?" I'd say that anyone who thinks tenant advocacy is easy work obviously hasn't tried to do it, Silas responded. Every case file on this desk represents a family in crisis. Finding solutions that keep people housed while maintaining property values requires real skill and real commitment. This isn't charity, it's professional social work applied to housing management. The interview concluded with footage of Silas and Jennifer Walsh meeting with the Patterson family, whose rent assistance had allowed them to keep their apartment while the father recovered from a construction accident. Mrs. Patterson's testimony about what stable housing meant for her children's education and her family's mental health provided a powerful human element to the story. But as the camera crews packed up their equipment, Thalia received a text message that brought the day's success into stark perspective. "Board meeting. Emergency session, tomorrow at 8 a.m., the message read. "Motion to remove you as CEO will be presented. Suggest you prepare for vigorous defense of your recent decisions. R. Hawthorne." She showed the message to Silas, who read it with growing concern. "He's moving faster than we expected," Silas observed. "The television coverage probably forced his hand," Thalia replied. "Once this story airs tonight, our approach to tenant advocacy becomes public knowledge. If he's going to challenge it, he needs to act before public opinion makes it politically impossible." They spent the rest of the afternoon preparing for the confrontation, gathering financial data that demonstrated the profitability of the tenant advocacy programs, collecting testimonials from families who had been helped, and reviewing the legal documentation that governed board authority over CEO decisions. But as they worked, both Thalia and Silas were aware that they were fighting more than a corporate governance dispute. They were challenging fundamental assumptions about the role of business in society, about whether companies had obligations beyond profit maximization, and about whether wealth carried with it any responsibility for addressing social problems. The next morning would determine whether their experiment in socially conscious capitalism could survive the opposition of those who viewed any deviation from pure profit-seeking as a betrayal of fiduciary duty. More importantly, it would determine whether the families who had come to depend on Pinnacle's supportive approach to housing would continue to have access to the stability and assistance that had changed their lives. As Silas locked up the Tenant Advocacy Center that evening, he reflected on how much his life had changed since that night in the parking garage. 3 months ago, he had been facing homelessness with no prospects beyond daily survival. Now he was part of a movement that was challenging some of the most fundamental assumptions about how business should operate in modern society. But he was also aware that everything they had built could be destroyed by a single vote in a corporate boardroom, decided by people who had never missed a meal or worried about making rent, people who viewed housing as a commodity rather than a human necessity. The success of their programs had made enemies as well as allies, and tomorrow would test whether good intentions and positive results could overcome the entrenched interests of those who profited from maintaining the status quo. The emergency board meeting was scheduled for 8 a.m., but Thalia arrived at the NeuralSync building at 6:30, needing time to review her presentation materials and prepare for what would likely be the most important professional confrontation of her career. The security guard at the front desk greeted her with unusual sympathy, suggesting that word of the leadership challenge had spread throughout the building. She was surprised to find Silas already in the Tenant Advocacy Center, not reviewing case files as she might have expected, but staring out the window at the city skyline with an expression of deep concern. "You're here early," she observed, setting her briefcase down on his desk. "Couldn't sleep," Silas admitted. "I keep thinking about all the families who are going to be affected if Hawthorne succeeds in shutting down these programs." "He's not going to succeed," Thalia said firmly, though she wasn't entirely convinced of her own words. "The financial data supports what we're doing. The tenant advocacy programs are profitable, they're reducing operational costs, and they're generating positive publicity that benefits all of our business units." "Richard Hawthorne doesn't care about positive publicity," Silas replied. "He cares about maximizing short-term returns and maintaining the kind of business practices that allow people like him to extract wealth without considering the human cost." Their conversation was interrupted by Thalia's phone ringing. The caller ID showed her executive assistant's number, but when she answered, it wasn't her assistant's voice on the line. "Miss Vance, this is Dr. Rodriguez at Mercy General Hospital. Your assistant Patricia Williams has been in a serious car accident. She's asking for you." The words hit Thalia like a physical blow. Patricia had worked for her for 8 years, managing not just her professional schedule but serving as a confidant and friend who knew the details of both her business and personal life. More than that, Patricia was a single mother whose salary and health insurance benefits were crucial for supporting her teenage son Marcus, who was a senior in high school with plans to attend college in the fall. "How serious?" Thalia asked, grabbing her coat and keys. "She's stable, but she's going to need surgery for internal injuries," Dr. Rodriguez explained. "She specifically asked me to call you before anyone else. She seemed very concerned about something related to your work schedule today." Thalia checked her watch. 7:15 a.m. The board meeting that would determine the future of the tenant advocacy programs was scheduled to begin in 45 minutes, and she had no idea how long the hospital visit would take. "I'm on my way," she told the doctor, ending the call. Silas had heard enough of the conversation to understand the basic situation. "Go," he said immediately. "Patricia needs you, and that's more important than any board meeting." "But the vote," Thalia protested. "If I'm not there to defend the programs, Hawthorne will have a clear path to shut everything down." "Then I'll go in your place," Silas said, standing up and straightening his tie. It was one of only 2 ties he owned, purchased specifically for public speaking events related to the tenant advocacy work. "Silas, you don't have authority to speak for the company in a board meeting," Thalia pointed out. "You're not even technically a NeuralSync employee. Your salary comes from Pinnacle." "Then give me authority," he replied. "Make me your official representative for this meeting. I know the financial data as well as you do. I know the case studies, and I've been dealing with board member questions about the program for months." Thalia hesitated. Sending Silas to represent her in the most important board meeting of her career was an enormous risk. He had never dealt with the kind of aggressive corporate politics that Hawthorne specialized in, and his working-class background might make him an easy target for condescension and manipulation. But Patricia's situation was genuinely urgent, and Silas had proven himself capable of handling pressure in ways that most corporate executives never could. "Are you sure about this?" she asked. "I'm sure that Patricia's son shouldn't have to wonder if his mother is going to be okay while you're sitting in a conference room defending programs that exist to help families exactly like theirs," Silas replied. "And I'm sure that everything we've built here is worth fighting for even if I have to do the fighting alone." Thalia made her decision. She pulled out her phone and called the board secretary, authorizing Silas to act as her official representative with full authority to speak on behalf of the company's property management policies. Then she grabbed a folder containing backup copies of all their presentation materials and handed it to him. "The key points are highlighted in green," she said quickly. "The financial projections show consistent profitability. The tenant satisfaction surveys demonstrate significant improvement in resident retention, and the case studies provide concrete examples of families who were helped rather than displaced." "I've got it," Silas assured her. "Go take care of Patricia. We'll handle the board." Thalia left for the hospital while Silas gathered the presentation materials and prepared for the most important professional challenge of his life. He had 30 minutes to review complex financial data and prepare arguments that could determine the future of programs that had transformed hundreds of lives. At Mercy General Hospital, Thalia found Patricia conscious but sedated in the pre-operative area, her normally immaculate appearance replaced by hospital gowns and monitoring equipment. Despite her obvious pain and the medication, Patricia's first concern was for Thalia's work schedule. "The board meeting," Patricia whispered. "Hawthorne called 3 times yesterday trying to get information about your presentation. I didn't tell him anything, but he knows you're vulnerable." "Don't worry about the board meeting," Thalia said, taking her assistant's hand. "Silas is handling it. Your only job right now is to focus on getting better." "Marcus," Patricia said, her voice growing weaker as the pre-operative medication took effect. "If something happens to me, his college fund is in the credit union. The paperwork is in my desk. He's been working so hard." "Nothing is going to happen to you," Thalia said firmly. "You're going to be fine, and Marcus is going to college as planned. I'll make sure of it." But as Patricia was wheeled into surgery, Thalia realized that her assistant's concerns about financial security were entirely justified. If Patricia was unable to work for an extended period, her salary would stop, her health insurance might not cover all the medical expenses, and her son's college plans could be derailed by circumstances completely beyond their control. It was exactly the kind of situation that the tenant advocacy programs were designed to address, but for employees rather than renters. The irony wasn't lost on Thalia that she had been so focused on helping strangers that she hadn't fully considered how her own employees might need similar support during personal crises. Meanwhile, in the NeuralSync boardroom, Silas faced a hostile audience of 12 board members, with Richard Hawthorne leading the charge against the tenant advocacy programs. The presentation he had prepared focused on financial data and operational improvements, but Hawthorne's attacks were more personal and philosophical. "Mr. Korath," Hawthorne said during the question period, "you're asking us to believe that a maintenance worker with no business education or corporate experience should be making decisions about how to allocate shareholder resources. Don't you think that's somewhat presumptuous? I think that someone who has actually experienced housing insecurity might have insights that are valuable when designing housing policies." Silas replied calmly, "My background isn't in corporate finance, but it is in understanding what it's like to worry about making rent while working multiple jobs. And that qualifies you to override the judgment of professional property managers who have decades of experience maximizing returns on real estate investments." Hawthorne pressed, "It qualifies me to recognize that maximizing short-term returns and providing stable housing aren't necessarily contradictory goals." Silas responded, "The data shows that our tenant advocacy programs have actually improved profitability while reducing the human cost of housing insecurity." The debate continued for 2 hours, with Hawthorne attempting to portray the programs as expensive charity that would ultimately harm the company's competitiveness. But Silas had done his homework, and he had something that Hawthorne lacked: genuine passion for the work and concrete examples of its positive impact. "Let me ask you this, Mr. Hawthorne," Silas said during one exchange. "What's the long-term value of a business model that treats housing as purely extractive? What happens when working families can't afford to live near their jobs,
when children have to change schools every time their parents hit a rough patch, when elderly residents lose their community connections because they can't keep up with rent increases. Those are social problems, Hawthorne replied dismissively. Not business problems. They become business problems when your workforce can't afford to live in the communities where you operate, Silas countered. They become business problems when your customer base is constantly dealing with housing instability. And they become business problems when your reputation suffers because people associate your company with predatory practices. The vote, when it finally came, was closer than either side had expected. Hawthorne's motion to terminate the tenant advocacy programs and remove Thalia from her CEO position failed by a single vote, with several board members citing Silas's presentation as influential in their decision. But as Silas left the boardroom, he knew that the victory was temporary. Hawthorne had made it clear that he would continue fighting the programs through whatever means necessary, and the razor-thin margin of victory suggested that support for the social responsibility approach remained fragile. Back at the hospital, Thalia received news that Patricia's surgery had been successful, but that her recovery would require several months of reduced activity and ongoing medical treatment. The financial implications for Patricia's family were significant, despite her health insurance coverage. That afternoon, as Thalia and Silas met to debrief from their respective crises, they realized that the day had taught them something crucial about the sustainability of their work. Creating programs to help tenants was important, but it wasn't sufficient if they didn't address the broader patterns of economic insecurity that affected everyone from maintenance workers to executive assistants. We need to expand the concept, Thalia said as they sat in Patricia's hospital room, watching her sleep peacefully after the surgery. It's not just about tenant advocacy. It's about creating business practices that acknowledge that everyone, employees, tenants, customers, occasionally faces circumstances beyond their control. An emergency assistance fund for employees, Silas suggested. That and flexible work arrangements, comprehensive healthcare coverage, and job protection policies that don't penalize people for family emergencies. Thalia agreed. The same principles that make tenant advocacy work can be applied to employment practices. As they developed their expanded vision for socially conscious business practices, neither of them realized that Richard Hawthorne was already implementing his next strategy for shutting down their programs. The narrow defeat in the boardroom had convinced him that direct confrontation wouldn't work, but there were other ways to achieve his objectives. Sometimes the most dangerous attacks came not from open opposition, but from seemingly supportive allies who had their own hidden agendas. The first sign of trouble came 3 weeks after Patricia's accident, when Silas noticed irregularities in the Tenant Assistance Fund records. Payment authorizations that he had never approved were showing up in the system, and families were receiving financial assistance for amounts far exceeding the established guidelines. What concerned him most was that these unauthorized payments all seemed to involve properties managed by Marcus Chen, one of Pinnacle's regional supervisors who had initially opposed the tenant advocacy programs, but had recently become one of their most vocal supporters. Something's not right here, Silas told Jennifer Walsh as they reviewed the discrepancies during their weekly case management meeting. The Henderson family received $1,500 for a security deposit assistance, but our maximum authorization for that category is $500. The Morrison family got $2,000 for emergency rent relief, but they were only 2 months behind at $400 per month. Jennifer pulled up the digital records on her laptop, cross-referencing the payments with the original case files. These all have approval signatures from Marcus Chen, but they also have secondary authorizations that appear to be forged, she observed. Someone's been manipulating the system to make it look like we're spending far more money than we actually are. The implications were immediately clear to both of them. If someone was artificially inflating the costs of the tenant advocacy programs, they could create financial data that would support Richard Hawthorne's arguments about the unsustainability of socially conscious business practices. More importantly, The unauthorized payments were likely being diverted from families who genuinely needed assistance. Silas immediately called Thalia, who was at the hospital visiting Patricia during her lunch break. Patricia's recovery was progressing well but slowly, and Thalia had been spending several hours each day helping coordinate her medical care and ensuring that her son Marcus had everything he needed for his final semester of high school. "We have a problem," Silas said without preamble when Thalia answered her phone. "Someone's been manipulating the tenant assistance fund records to make it look like we're spending money we're not spending."
"How much money are we talking about?" Thalia asked, her voice tight with concern. "Over the past 3 weeks, approximately $30,000 in fraudulent authorizations," Silas replied, "all attributed to Marcus Chen's properties, all involving families that either don't exist or never requested assistance." Thalia was quiet for a moment, processing the implications. $30,000 wasn't a significant amount relative to Pinnacle's overall budget, but it represented a substantial portion of the tenant assistance fund, and the timing was suspicious. The board was scheduled to review the program's financial performance in 2 weeks, and inflated cost figures could provide exactly the ammunition that Hawthorne needed to shut down the entire operation. "Where's Marcus Chen right now?" she asked. "That's part of the problem," Silas said. "He called in sick today, and his office phone is going straight to voicemail. I drove by 2 of the properties where these fraudulent payments supposedly occurred, and the building managers have never heard of the families mentioned in the paperwork. We need to document everything before confronting him," Thalia said. "If this is deliberate sabotage, we need ironclad evidence. Meet me at the office in an hour, and bring Jennifer. We're going to go through every single transaction from the past month." The investigation took most of the afternoon, and revealed a sophisticated scheme to discredit the tenant advocacy programs. Marcus Chen had been creating fictitious assistance cases, generating false paperwork that showed dramatically inflated program costs, and then quietly routing the funds to accounts that couldn't be easily traced. The scheme was designed to be discovered just before the board review, creating the impression that the programs were poorly managed and financially irresponsible. But as they dug deeper into the digital records, they found something even more disturbing. Marcus Chen's computer had been remotely accessed multiple times over the past month, by an IP address, registered to Hawthorne Industries, Richard Hawthorne's investment firm. Someone with sophisticated technical knowledge had been helping Chen manipulate the records and cover their tracks. "This isn't just embezzlement," Jennifer observed as they reviewed the digital forensics evidence. "This is a coordinated attempt to frame the tenant advocacy programs for financial mismanagement." Thalia stared at the computer screen, feeling a familiar mixture of anger and betrayal that reminded her of the night in the parking garage, when she had first realized how vulnerable she was to people who viewed her success as something to be exploited. But this time, the attack wasn't coming from street criminals. It was coming from people within her own business network, who supposedly shared her professional interests. "We need to call the police," she said finally. "This is fraud, embezzlement, and probably corporate espionage." "Are you sure you want to involve law enforcement?" Silas asked. "Once this becomes a criminal investigation, the story will become public. Every news outlet that covered the tenant advocacy programs will want to follow up with stories about the financial scandal. Even if we prove that Chen was working with outside saboteurs, the damage to our credibility could be irreversible." It was a calculated risk. Exposing the sabotage would vindicate their programs but also generate negative publicity that could undermine public and investor confidence. On the other hand, allowing the fraudulent records to stand would give Hawthorne exactly the ammunition he needed to shut down the programs permanently. "We can't let them get away with this," Thalia said. "If we don't fight back, they'll just try something else. And more importantly, the families who depend on these programs deserve to know that we'll protect their interests even when it's politically or financially inconvenient." The police investigation moved quickly once digital forensics experts confirmed the evidence of remote computer access and financial manipulation. Marcus Chen was arrested at his home 2 days later, and a search warrant for Hawthorne Industries offices revealed extensive documentation of the sabotage plan. But Richard Hawthorne was too sophisticated to leave direct evidence of his involvement. While the investigation confirmed that his company's computers had accessed Chen's system, his lawyers argued that this could have been the result of malware or unauthorized access by rogue employees. Hawthorne himself maintained complete deniability, claiming that he had been unaware of any sabotage efforts and expressing shock at the allegations. The story broke in the local media just 4 days before the scheduled board meeting, with headlines focusing on the fraud investigation and the apparent attempt to discredit corporate social responsibility programs. The coverage was a double-edged sword. It vindicated the tenant advocacy programs by exposing the sabotage, but it also raised questions about the company's internal security and management oversight. Board meeting postponed pending investigation, read the headline in the business section of the morning paper. CEO Thalia Vance faces questions about her ability to protect shareholders from internal fraud. Silas found Thalia in her office early that morning, surrounded by newspapers and printouts of online articles, trying to assess the damage to her company's reputation and the future prospects for the tenant advocacy programs. "How bad is it?" he asked, settling into the chair across from her desk. "Professionally, it's manageable," Thalia replied. "The forensics evidence is clear. The police investigation supports our version of events, and most of the board members understand that we were victims of sabotage rather than perpetrators of mismanagement." "But," Silas prompted, sensing that there was more to her assessment, "but Hawthorne is already using this as evidence that socially conscious business practices make companies vulnerable to exploitation," Thalia explained. "He's arguing that our focus on helping tenants distracted us from proper financial oversight and created opportunities for fraud that wouldn't exist in a more traditional business model." The argument was cynical but effective. Even though the tenant advocacy programs had been the target rather than the source of the fraud, Hawthorne was positioning the incident as proof that companies shouldn't deviate from purely profit-focused approaches to business. "So what do we do now?" Silas asked. Thalia stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the city where hundreds of families were living in pinnacle properties, under policies that prioritize stability and support over maximum profit extraction. "We double down," she said finally. "We expand the programs, increase the transparency, and prove that business practices that prioritize human dignity aren't just morally superior but also more resilient against this kind of attack. That's going to make us even bigger targets," Silas pointed out. "Good," Thalia replied, turning back to face him. "Let them come after us. Every attack they make just proves how threatened they are by the idea that business can be conducted in ways that benefit everyone involved, not just the people at the top of the economic pyramid." The postponed board meeting was finally held the following week, with additional board members attending via video conference to observe the confrontation between Thalia's vision for socially conscious capitalism and Hawthorne's insistence on traditional profit maximization approaches. This time, Thalia presented the case herself, using the sabotage attempt as evidence that their programs were effective enough to warrant coordinated opposition from those who profited from housing insecurity and economic desperation. "The fact that someone felt it necessary to commit fraud in order to discredit these programs tells you everything you need to know about their actual effectiveness," she argued. "If tenant advocacy was really bad for business, they wouldn't have needed to fabricate evidence of financial problems." The vote, when it came, was decisive. Not only did the board reject Hawthorne's motion to terminate the tenant advocacy programs, but they also approved Thalia's proposal to expand similar initiatives across all of the company's business units. But as the meeting concluded, Hawthorne approached Thalia with a final threat that revealed the true depth of his opposition to her business philosophy. "You think you've won something here," he said quietly, making sure that no other board members could overhear. "But this is just the beginning. I have resources you can't imagine, and I have allies throughout the business community who understand that what you're doing threatens the entire system that made us all wealthy." "Are you threatening me personally, Richard?" Thalia asked, keeping her voice calm despite the menace in his tone. "I'm promising you that if you continue down this path, you'll discover just how much resistance organized wealth can generate when it feels threatened," Hawthorne replied. "Your little experiment in corporate altruism has made enemies of people who don't forgive and don't forget." As he walked away, Thalia realized that the battle for the future of socially conscious business practices had only just begun. The victory in the boardroom was important, but it had also escalated a conflict that now involved forces far more powerful and dangerous than a single disgruntled investor. The woman who had started this journey as a victim of street crime was now facing threats from people who commanded resources and influence that made her original attackers look like amateurs. But she was no longer the same person who had been cornered in that parking garage 9 months earlier, and she was no longer fighting alone. The resolution came not through corporate boardrooms or legal proceedings, but through the power of investigative journalism and public scrutiny. 3 days after Richard Hawthorne's veiled threats, Maria Santos from Channel 7 News called Thalia with information that would change everything. "We've been investigating Hawthorne Industries' business practices as a follow-up to our tenant advocacy story," Santos explained during their phone conversation. "What we found goes far beyond the Marcus Chen sabotage incident." Santos had uncovered a pattern of corporate espionage and market manipulation that stretched across multiple industries and involved several prominent business leaders who shared Hawthorne's philosophy about maximizing profits regardless of social cost. Internal emails obtained through a whistleblower revealed explicit discussions about neutralizing companies that prioritize social responsibility over pure profit maximization. "They have a whole network," Santos continued. "Real estate companies, pharmaceutical firms, private equity groups, all coordinating to undermine competitors who try to implement socially conscious business practices. They call themselves the Profit Priority Coalition, and your tenant advocacy programs were specifically mentioned as a threat that needed to be eliminated." The evidence was damning. Email communications showed Hawthorne personally authorizing payments to Marcus Chen for his sabotage efforts, discussing strategies for discrediting Thalia's leadership, and coordinating with other investors to short-sell Neuralink stock in anticipation of the company's anticipated failure. More significantly, the investigation revealed that similar sabotage efforts had been conducted against at least 12 other companies that had attempted to implement progressive employment or customer service practices. The Profit Priority Coalition had systematically destroyed businesses and careers of executives who dared to suggest that capitalism could serve purposes beyond wealth concentration. The story aired as a special investigative report that generated immediate national attention. Within hours of the broadcast, the Securities and Exchange Commission announced a formal investigation into market manipulation, and several major investors publicly withdrew their support from Hawthorne Industries. Hawthorne himself was arrested 2 days later on charges of securities fraud, corporate espionage and racketeering. The perp walk footage of the wealthy investor in handcuffs became a symbol of accountability for corporate executives who believed their wealth placed them above legal consequences. "The investigation is ongoing," Detective Rodriguez told reporters outside the courthouse, "but we have evidence suggesting this conspiracy affected dozens of companies and thousands of employees across multiple states." In her office that evening, Thalia watched the news coverage with Silas, both of them still processing the magnitude of what had been revealed. The threat they had been facing wasn't just personal or professional. It had been part of a systematic campaign to prevent American businesses from evolving beyond pure profit-seeking. "It's over," Silas said quietly as they watched Hawthorne's attorney proclaim his client's innocence to a skeptical press corps. "No," Thalia replied, her voice filled with determination rather than relief. "It's just beginning. Now we know how much our work matters, and how many people are depending on us to prove that business can be done differently." The victory felt surreal, but it was undeniably complete. 2 years after that fateful night in the Meridian Tower parking garage, the same underground space had been transformed into something unprecedented in corporate America. Where flickering fluorescent lights had once cast ominous shadows, warm LED panels now provided consistent illumination. Where concrete pillars had offered hiding places for predators, colorful murals now depicted scenes of community strength and mutual support. Most significantly, where Thalia Vance had once faced her greatest vulnerability, a bronze plaque now marked the location as the founding site of the National Tenant Advocacy Institute. The transformation extended far beyond aesthetics. Level B3 of Meridian Tower had been converted into a community resource center that operated 24 hours a day. Staffed by social workers,
legal advocates, and peer counselors who understood firsthand the challenges of housing insecurity. The space served not just residents of Pinnacle Properties, but anyone in the city facing housing-related crises. Thalia stood before a gathering of 300 people in the building's renovated conference center, addressing the second annual Community Impact Awards ceremony. The audience included tenant advocates from across the country, social workers, formerly homeless individuals who had become community leaders, and business executives who had implemented similar programs in their own companies. When I first walked into this building 2 years ago, I thought I understood success, she said, her voice carrying easily through the packed auditorium. I had built companies worth hundreds of millions of dollars, employed thousands of people, and achieved everything I thought I wanted. But I had never asked the most important question: what was my success actually accomplishing for the world beyond my own bank account? In the front row, Silas Korath sat with his small family, no longer the struggling maintenance worker who had risked everything for a stranger, but now the executive director of community relations for what had become the largest tenant advocacy network in North America. Beside him sat his wife of 6 months, Jennifer Walsh, the social worker who had helped build their programs from the ground up. Their combined work had directly prevented over 2,000 evictions, helped establish emergency assistance funds in 43 cities, and influenced housing policy legislation in 12 states. The answer to that question changed my life, Thalia continued, but more importantly, it changed how I understood the responsibility that comes with economic success. Wealth isn't just about accumulation, it's about circulation. It's about ensuring that prosperity creates more prosperity, that opportunity generates more opportunity, that success lifts up entire communities rather than just individuals. Behind her, a massive screen displayed statistics that would have seemed impossible 2 years earlier. Pinnacle Property Management now boasted the highest tenant satisfaction ratings in the industry, while maintaining profit margins that exceeded traditional property management companies. The tenant advocacy model had been adopted by over 200 property management firms across the country, and similar approaches had been implemented in healthcare, retail, and manufacturing sectors. Patricia Williams, now fully recovered and serving as Director of Employee Advocacy for NeuralSync Technologies, took the podium to introduce the evening's keynote speaker. Her son Marcus had graduated valedictorian from his high school and was now a sophomore at Stanford University, studying social entrepreneurship with plans to expand community-focused business practices internationally. Our keynote speaker tonight represents the power of second chances and the importance of seeing potential where others see only problems. Patricia announced, "Please welcome Dr. Sarah Chen, Director of the Urban Housing Research Institute at Georgetown University." Dr. Chen was the sister of Marcus Chen, the property manager who had been caught sabotaging the tenant advocacy programs 2 years earlier. Instead of distancing herself from her brother's actions, she had used the incident as motivation to research and develop better approaches to preventing corporate fraud, while protecting social responsibility initiatives. "My brother made terrible choices that hurt people who were trying to help vulnerable families," Dr. Chen said as she began her presentation. "But rather than pretend that corruption doesn't exist in socially conscious businesses, we need to develop systems that make such businesses more resilient and transparent than traditional profit-focused companies." Her research had led to the development of blockchain-based transparency protocols that made financial manipulation virtually impossible, while maintaining the flexibility necessary for emergency assistance programs. The technology was now being used by over 500 organizations worldwide. As the ceremony concluded, Thalia and Silas found themselves back in the parking garage where their partnership had begun, now transformed but still recognizable as the site where two strangers had discovered they could change each other's lives by changing how they understood success and responsibility. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't been working late that night?" Thalia asked, looking at the bronze plaque that marked the exact spot where 5 men had cornered her with criminal intent. "I think about it all the time," Silas replied, "but not because I regret what happened. I think about it because it reminds me how many other moments like that are happening right now, all over the city, all over the country. Moments when someone has to choose between walking away from a problem or stepping up to help solve it. They walked toward the elevator that would take them back to the Community Resource Center, where the night shift was preparing to assist families facing eviction, domestic violence, medical emergencies, and dozens of other crises that could destroy lives if left unaddressed. The beautiful thing, Thalia said as they waited for the elevator, is that we've proven those moments don't have to be rare individual acts of heroism. We've built systems that make helping people a normal part of how business operates. Above them, in apartments throughout the city, families slept securely in homes they could afford, because of policies that prioritize stability over maximum profit extraction. Children attended the same schools for years instead of being uprooted by frequent evictions. Elderly residents aged in communities where they had built relationships and support networks. The transformation was measurable in statistics, but more importantly, it was visible in the faces of people who no longer had to choose between paying rent and buying medicine, between staying in unsafe housing and becoming homeless, between maintaining dignity and asking for help. As they reached the Community Resource Center, now bustling with activity, as night shift advocates assisted families throughout the city, Thalia realized that the most valuable security she had ever created wasn't found in corporate firewalls or personal bodyguards, but in the connections forged when people chose to help each other rather than exploit each other. The woman who had once been a target for predators had become a beacon for people who believed that wealth and power could be used to create more wealth and power for everyone. The man who had once faced homelessness had become an architect of systems that ensured no one had to face such threats alone. Sometimes, the most profound transformations begin with the simplest choice to help a stranger in need, and to keep helping until the world becomes the kind of place where such help is no longer extraordinary, but ordinary. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell, so you don't miss any upload from us.